The snow had been falling steadily since tea time, transforming the village of St. Mary Mead into something resembling a particularly well-composed Christmas card. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, adjusting her woolen shawl as she observed the pristine white blanket settling over the churchyard and the imposing silhouette of Rawdon Hall beyond. At 73, she had witnessed many winters in this quiet corner of England, but there was something about this particular evening's snowfall that seemed almost too perfect, too concealing. The annual Christmas Eve gathering at Rawdon Hall had concluded just an hour earlier, and Miss Marple could still see the warm glow emanating from the manor's tall windows. Sir Henry Rawdon, recently returned from 30 years of diplomatic service abroad, had hosted his traditional celebration with characteristic reserve, inviting half the village to partake in mulled wine and his housekeeper's famous mince pies. Miss Marple had attended briefly, noting with her usual quiet attention the subtle tensions that seemed to simmer beneath the festive atmosphere. Young Lionel Rawdon, Sir Henry's nephew and presumptive heir, had been particularly animated that evening, his easy charm working its familiar magic on the assembled villagers. At 28, Lionel possessed the kind of effortless appeal that made him popular with everyone from the vicar's daughter to the local shopkeepers, though Miss Marple had detected something slightly forced in his jovial demeanor. She had observed him engaged in hushed conversations throughout the evening, discussions that ceased abruptly whenever others approached. The drawing-room had buzzed with the usual mixture of village gossip and seasonal cheer. Mrs. Emmeline Carter had held court near the fireplace, dispensing observations about Lionel's recent gambling debts with the authority of someone who considered herself the village's moral compass. Dr. Gray, lean and competent, had balanced his glass of mulled wine while keeping one eye on the weather, clearly thinking of patients who might need him before morning. Harold Rawdon, Sir Henry's pinched cousin who worked in a solicitor's office, had found numerous opportunities to express his disapproval of Lionel's continental adventures and expensive tastes. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the tea service, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a new scarf. From this vantage point, she had noticed several telling details. The way Lionel's hand trembled slightly when reaching for his brandy, the nervous glances he exchanged with Kitty Barnes, the vicar's daughter, and most particularly, the cold fury that flickered briefly across Sir Henry's face when Harold mentioned something about family responsibilities and settling down. Around 10 o'clock, as the evening wound toward its natural conclusion, Lionel had announced his intention to take a brief walk in the garden. "All this warmth is making me quite drowsy," he had declared with his characteristic smile. "A quick turn about the grounds to clear my head." Sir Henry had offered a mild protest about the bitter cold, but Lionel had merely laughed, grabbing his heavy coat and the silk scarf Kitty had knitted for him. "Nonsense, uncle. A little fresh air never hurt anyone." The conversation had continued for perhaps another 20 minutes, though with noticeably less animation. Miss Marple had felt a familiar prickle of unease as the minutes stretched on. Lionel had been gone far longer than a quick turn would suggest, and the wind outside had begun to howl with increasing ferocity. Sir Henry, too, had grown visibly agitated, repeatedly glancing at the mantelpiece clock. Finally, Dr. Gray had volunteered to check on the young man, accompanied by Colonel Bantry and Mr. Clement. The three figures had bundled into their coats and disappeared into the swirling snow, leaving behind a drawing-room filled with increasingly anxious faces. The scream that shattered the winter silence 10 minutes later was Dr. Gray's voice, raw with shock and disbelief. It cut through the night like a blade, freezing the blood of everyone within earshot. The drawing-room erupted into chaos as people rushed toward the windows and doors, but Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting fallen still in her lap, her bright eyes already beginning to catalogue the evening's events with the methodical precision that had served her so well in the past. When Colonel Bantry's voice boomed across the garden, confirming their worst fears, Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. Young Lionel Rawdon had been found in the snow beneath the old oak tree, quite dead, wearing only his evening clothes. His coat lay several yards away, and there was something distinctly odd about the pattern of footprints leading to and from the body. As the village constable was summoned and the inevitable questions began, Miss Marple found herself thinking about human nature, about the curious ways people behaved when they believed themselves unobserved, and about how snow, like truth, had a way of revealing what people preferred to keep hidden. The drawing room at Rawdon Hall had transformed from a scene of festive warmth into something altogether more sinister. The assembled guests huddled together in small groups, their earlier conviviality replaced by hushed whispers and furtive glances. Dr. Gray stood near the fireplace, methodically brushing snow from his coat sleeves, while his professional mind catalogued the disturbing details he had observed in the garden. The position of the body, the scattered clothing, the peculiar absence of defensive wounds, all suggested something far more complex than a simple accident or even a crime of passion. Mrs. Emmeline Carter had positioned herself strategically near the tea service, from where she could observe and comment upon everyone's reactions with her characteristic blend of moral authority and barely concealed excitement. "Mark my words," she declared to anyone within earshot, her voice pitched at that particular volume that suggested confidentiality while ensuring maximum audibility. "Young men who live as Lionel did, gambling, drinking, carrying on with unsuitable companions, they inevitably attract the wrong sort of attention. One hears such dreadful stories about debts to dangerous people." Her eyes swept meaningfully across the room, lingering particularly on Harold Rawdon, who had grown notably pale since returning from the garden. Harold himself seemed caught between grief and something that looked suspiciously like calculation. He cleared his throat repeatedly, his nervous habit becoming more pronounced as the minutes passed. "A terrible tragedy for the family," he murmured to Mr. Clement, though his tone lacked genuine sorrow. One must consider the practical implications, of course. Lionel had accumulated considerable financial obligations, gambling debts, expensive tastes, that motor car he couldn't possibly afford on his allowance. His intimate knowledge of his cousin's financial affairs struck several listeners as oddly comprehensive for someone who claimed only casual family interest. Sir Henry remained standing by the mantelpiece, his weathered hands gripping the marble edge as if drawing strength from its solidity. The shock had drained all color from his face, leaving him looking every one of his 72 years. "Not my boy," he kept repeating under his breath, though whether he referred to Lionel's death or his alleged misdeeds remained unclear. His eyes, when they weren't fixed on the garden windows, kept returning to Harold with an expression that mixed grief with something approaching suspicion. Kitty Barnes had collapsed into a chair near the piano, her earlier composure completely shattered. Great sobs shook her slight frame as she clutched a handkerchief that had long since become sodden. "He promised me he was going to change," she wept to her father, Reverend Barnes, who patted her shoulder with the helpless awkwardness of a man more comfortable with theological than emotional crises. "He said the gambling was finished, that he wanted to settle down, make a proper life." Her words carried the desperate conviction of someone trying to convince herself as much as others. The arrival of Inspector Slack brought a welcome sense of official authority to the increasingly charged atmosphere. A practical man with little patience for village dramatics, he surveyed the assembled company with sharp, assessing eyes before addressing Sir Henry directly. "I'll need to speak with everyone individually," he announced briskly, consulting his notebook. "The victim was last seen alive at approximately 10:15. Dr. Gray discovered the body at 10:45, which gives us a window of roughly 30 minutes. His gaze swept the room with professional thoroughness. "Someone here knows what happened during that time." The inspector's words fell into a silence that seemed to crystallize the unspoken suspicions already circulating through the room. Mrs. Carter's theories about dangerous creditors, Harold's suspicious familiarity with Lionel's debts, Kitty's emotional devastation, All suddenly took on new significance under the weight of official scrutiny. Miss Marple continued her quiet knitting, her needles clicking with metronomic regularity as she absorbed every word, every gesture, every telling silence. She had already noted several intriguing details. The way Harold's knowledge of Lionel's financial troubles seemed remarkably specific, Kitty's alternating grief and what might have been fear, and most particularly, the subtle but unmistakable relief that had flickered across more than one face when Dr. Gray confirmed that poor Lionel was indeed dead. Human nature, she reflected, had a way of revealing itself most clearly in moments of crisis, and tonight's tragedy was already illuminating several very interesting aspects of her neighbors' characters. Inspector Slack established his temporary headquarters in Sir Henry's oak-paneled study, transforming the scholarly sanctuary into an efficient command center for his investigation. The methodical policeman arranged the interviews with characteristic precision, beginning with those who had discovered the body and working systematically through each guest's account of the evening's events. Miss Marple, having positioned herself near the tea service with her ever-present knitting, found herself in the advantageous position of observing each person's demeanor both before and after their interrogation. Dr. Gray emerged first from his interview, his professional composure intact, but his eyes troubled by details that extended beyond the mere fact of death. He accepted tea with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, confiding to Colonel Bantry in low tones about the disturbing aspects of the scene. "Poor fellow had been dead at least 20 minutes when we found him," he murmured, his medical authority lending weight to his words. "No obvious wounds, no signs of struggle, but the ground around the body showed multiple sets of footprints, some quite fresh, others deliberately obscured as if someone had taken pains to muddle their tracks." He paused, glancing toward the study door. "The inspector seems particularly interested in what happened to Lionel's outdoor clothing. The coat was found several yards away, almost as if it had been deliberately removed and discarded." Harold Rawdon's interview lasted considerably longer, and when he finally emerged, his earlier nervous energy had transformed into something approaching satisfaction. He declined tea, instead moving restlessly between the windows and fireplace, his financial mind clearly working through implications that extended far beyond grief. "The inspector understands the serious nature of Lionel's debts," he confided to Mrs. Carter, though his voice carried a peculiar note of vindication. "Gambling obligations can lead to most unpleasant consequences, particularly when one associates with questionable London companions. Professional collectors don't hesitate to use violence when gentlemen default on their obligations." Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the faint stain on Harold's left cuff, a smudge that looked suspiciously like damp earth, despite his earlier claims of remaining indoors throughout the evening. Kitty Barnes' testimony proved the most emotionally challenging, her sobs echoing through the study door as Inspector Slack pressed for details about Lionel's recent behavior and concerns. When she finally emerged, supported by her father's gentle arm, her face was blotchy with tears and something that might have been fear. "The inspector kept asking about Lionel's plans," she whispered to Miss Marple, who had approached with maternal concern and a fresh handkerchief. "He wanted to know if Lionel had mentioned feeling threatened, if he'd received any unusual visitors." Her voice dropped to barely audible levels. "I had to tell him about the man who came to see Lionel last week, the one with the London accent who made Lionel so nervous afterward." This revelation sent ripples of speculation through the remaining guests. The mysterious London visitor seemed to validate Mrs. Carter's theories about dangerous creditors, while Colonel Bantry immediately began theorizing about professional debt collectors. "Well-dressed but somehow menacing," Kitty continued, shuddering at the memory. "Lionel claimed he was just a business acquaintance, but I could tell he was frightened. He kept checking the windows for days afterward, as if expecting someone to be watching." Sir Henry's interview proved surprisingly brief, and when he emerged, he seemed more puzzled than distressed. "The inspector appears convinced that Lionel was killed by someone he knew," Sir Henry confided to Miss Marple, his voice carrying bewilderment. Someone who could approach him without causing alarm, someone familiar enough with the grounds to navigate them in darkness. But who among us would have reason to harm the boy? Yes, he had his faults, but murder seems incomprehensible. Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm as she absorbed these revelations, her mind cataloguing inconsistencies that others overlooked. If professional criminals had indeed come for Lionel, why kill him in such an exposed location rather than simply collecting their dead? The deliberate removal of his coat, the missing scarf that Kitty had knitted with such care, the multiple sets of footprints suggesting either struggle or deliberate deception, all pointed toward something far more personal than a business transaction gone wrong. The inspector's conviction that the killer was someone within their intimate circle troubled her most of all. Human nature, she reflected, had a way of revealing its darkest aspects when money, family expectations, and desperation converged in dangerous combinations. As the snow continued falling outside, obscuring the evidence beneath its pristine blanket, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the curious ways people behaved when they believed themselves unobserved, and how the most damaging secrets often hid behind the most respectable facades. Inspector Slack's methodical approach to the investigation began yielding concrete results as the night progressed, each piece of evidence seeming to point with increasing clarity toward one particular individual. The inspector had established his temporary command center in Sir Henry's study, methodically cataloguing witness statements and physical evidence with the thoroughness of a man determined to solve the case before dawn. His systematic questioning had revealed several troubling inconsistencies, particularly regarding Harold Rawdon's movements during the crucial 30-minute window when Lionel met his death. The first significant breakthrough came when Mrs. Judd, Sir Henry's unflappable housekeeper, provided testimony that contradicted Harold's careful account of remaining indoors throughout the evening. "I did notice Mr. Harold's absence from the drawing-room around 10:20, she stated with the precision of someone accustomed to observing household details. "He'd asked me to fetch his muffler from the cloakroom, claiming he felt a chill, but when I returned with it, he was nowhere to be found. I waited several minutes before he reappeared, and I couldn't help noticing that his shoes were quite damp, as if he'd stepped outside." Her words carried the weight of honest observation, delivered without malice but devastating in their implications. Harold's reaction to this revelation proved equally damaging to his credibility. Rather than offering a reasonable explanation for his brief absence, he became increasingly agitated, his earlier composed demeanor cracking under the pressure of scrutiny. "A man can hardly be expected to account for every moment of his evening," he protested, but his voice carried a defensive edge that suggested deeper concerns. "If I stepped out briefly for fresh air, surely that's not a criminal offense." The inspector noted, however, that Harold had made no previous mention of leaving the drawing-room, despite repeated opportunities to clarify his whereabouts. The physical evidence began accumulating with damning precision. Dr. Gray, examining Harold's clothing with professional thoroughness, confirmed the presence of fresh earth stains on his left cuff, stains that appeared inconsistent with remaining indoors throughout the evening. More significantly, the pattern of moisture on Harold's shoes suggested recent contact with snow, despite his claims of never venturing outside. When confronted with these observations, Harold's explanations became increasingly convoluted, ranging from accidental contact with a potted plant to condensation from the drawing-room windows. Inspector Slack's investigation of Harold's financial circumstances revealed a compelling motive that explained both his intimate knowledge of Lionel's debts and his obvious relief at his cousin's death. Harold's position as a solicitor's clerk provided barely adequate income, while his own gambling habits, carefully concealed from the family, had created mounting debts that threatened his professional reputation. The inheritance prospects following Lionel's death would solve his financial crisis completely, providing both immediate funds and long-term security through his enhanced position in Sir Henry's estate. The motive becomes crystal clear when one examines the financial implications. Inspector Slack explained to the assembled guests with growing confidence. Harold possessed detailed knowledge of Lionel's gambling debts, information that could provide convenient cover for murder by suggesting professional debt collectors as likely culprits. His own desperate financial circumstances created overwhelming pressure for a solution that Lionel's death would provide. The inspector's theory gained credibility as additional witnesses confirmed Harold's recent inquiries about inheritance laws and estate management procedures. Mrs. Carter, ever eager to contribute her observations, provided additional testimony that seemed to seal Harold's fate. "I've noticed Harold's increasing agitation over recent weeks," she confided with the authority of someone who considered herself an expert on human behavior. "He's been pressing Sir Henry about family obligations and proper estate planning with unusual persistence. Just last month, he made several pointed comments about Lionel's irresponsible lifestyle and its impact on family finances. Her words carried particular weight because they confirmed a pattern of resentment and calculation that supported the inspector's theory. The timeline evidence proved equally damaging to Harold's position. Multiple witnesses confirmed his nervous behavior throughout the evening, his repeated checking of his pocket watch, and his unusual interest in Lionel's plans for an evening walk. Colonel Bantry recalled Harold asking specific questions about the garden paths and whether they remained passable in heavy snow, questions that seemed innocuous at the time but now appeared suspiciously prescient. Miss Marple continued her quiet knitting throughout these revelations, her needles maintaining their steady rhythm as she absorbed each detail with characteristic attention. While the evidence against Harold appeared compelling, something about the inspector's increasingly confident theory troubled her methodical mind. The physical evidence seemed almost too abundant, too convenient for someone supposedly clever enough to plan and execute a murder. In her extensive experience with human nature, she had observed that genuine criminals rarely left such an obvious trail of evidence. While innocent, people often appeared guilty due to perfectly reasonable explanations they failed to provide under pressure. The missing elements of the crime scene continued to puzzle her as well. Lionel's coat had been found several yards from his body, apparently removed and discarded, while the silk scarf Kitty had knitted with such care remained missing entirely. If Harold had indeed killed his cousin in a moment of confrontation, would he have taken time to remove and relocate clothing? The methodical nature of these actions suggested either remarkable presence of mind during a violent encounter or perhaps an entirely different sequence of events than the inspector envisioned. As Inspector Slack's case against Harold solidified, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the curious ways people revealed their true nature under stress. Harold's desperate protestations of innocence, his increasingly frantic attempts to explain away the physical evidence, his obvious terror at being suspected of murder, all seemed more consistent with genuine shock than calculated deception. True criminals, in her long experience, often displayed remarkable composure when confronted with accusations, while innocent people frequently appeared guilty due to their very desperation to be believed. As Inspector Slack completed the formalities that would see Harold Rawdon taken into custody at first light, a curious sense of relief settled over the remaining guests at Rawdon Hall. The swift identification of a culprit, particularly one whose financial desperation provided such a clear motive, offered the comfort of a tidy conclusion to an otherwise inexplicable tragedy. Mrs. Carter voiced the general sentiment with her characteristic authority, declaring that she had always suspected something unsavory about Harold's excessive interest in family finances. Even Sir Henry, though still deeply shaken by his nephew's death, seemed to find grim solace in the notion that Lionel's killer was a known quantity rather than some mysterious figure from his gambling associates. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly unconvinced as she observed the proceedings with her characteristic blend of gentle attention and sharp perception. While the evidence against Harold appeared compelling, something about its very completeness troubled her methodical mind. In her extensive experience with human nature, she had observed that genuine criminals rarely left such an obvious trail of evidence, while innocent people often appeared guilty due to circumstances they failed to adequately explain under pressure. Excusing herself with a murmured comment about checking on poor Kitty, Miss Marple began her own careful examination of details that others had overlooked in their rush toward convenient conclusions. Her first discovery came in the servants' corridor, where Mrs. Judd was tidying up after the evening's disruptions. The housekeeper mentioned the side door that provided access to the garden, demonstrating how it required a particular technique to open properly. "Servants know it," she explained. "Strangers don't." Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the faint, delicate impression on the flagstones. Not the heavy boot prints of a man, but the smaller, more refined marks of a woman's footwear. More significantly, caught on the door's iron latch was a tiny wisp of thread, so small as to be nearly invisible. Miss Marple carefully extracted the fragment with her knitting needle, recognizing immediately the distinctive peacock-blue silk that Kitty had used for Lionel's Christmas scarf. The thread's presence on the rarely used door suggested someone had passed this way recently, someone wearing or carrying an item made from that particular silk. Her conversation with Kitty in the music room proved equally revealing, though in ways the distraught young woman clearly hadn't intended. When Miss Marple gently mentioned the beautiful color of the scarf Lionel had been wearing, Kitty's response carried an odd note of anxiety beneath her grief. "Peacock silk from the bazaar in much Benham," she whispered, adding with peculiar emphasis, "The label warned to keep it from damp or the color would run. I told him to be careful." The comment seemed innocuous enough, yet Miss Marple filed it away alongside her growing collection of seemingly insignificant details. Dr. Gray's clinical observations about the crime scene provided another crucial piece of the puzzle that others had dismissed as unimportant. He had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that while Lionel's heavy overcoat bore the expected accumulation of fresh snow on its outer surface, the inner lining remained remarkably dry and clean. This detail struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. If the coat had been removed during a violent struggle, it would have fallen haphazardly, exposing its inner surfaces to the continuing snowfall. The pristine condition of the lining suggested the coat had been placed deliberately, perhaps even carefully arranged, indicating a level of calculation that seemed inconsistent with Harold's panicked demeanor. When Miss Marple examined the coat more closely in Sir Henry's study, she noticed something that confirmed her growing suspicions. Along the inner edge of the facing was a faint tide line where damp had dried, leaving the barely visible trace of peacock-blue dye. If Kitty's silk scarf had indeed bled its color when wet, as she had specifically warned Lionel, then this stain provided tangible evidence of contact between the missing scarf and the discarded coat. The timing element proved equally crucial to Miss Marple's developing theory. Sir Henry mentioned, almost apologetically, that the mantelpiece clock ran 8 minutes fast, a household quirk designed to encourage punctuality among the staff. This seemingly minor detail cast new light on the established timeline of events. If witnesses had relied on the manor's clocks to establish Harold's movements, their testimony might be fundamentally flawed, providing him with an alibi that the investigation had failed to recognize. As the night wore on and arrangements were made to escort certain guests home under police supervision, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the curious ways people revealed their true nature under stress. Harold's desperate protestations of innocence, his obvious terror at being suspected of murder, his transparent confusion about the evidence against him, all seemed more consistent with genuine shock than calculated deception. True criminals, in her long experience, often displayed remarkable composure when confronted with accusations, while innocent people frequently appeared guilty due to their very desperation to be believed. The missing scarf continued to puzzle her as well. If Harold had indeed killed his cousin in a moment of financial desperation, would he have taken time to remove and conceal such a distinctive piece of evidence? The methodical nature of these actions suggested either remarkable presence of mind during a violent encounter or perhaps an entirely different sequence of events than Inspector Slack envisioned. Walking home through the gently falling snow with Colonel Bantry's steadying arm, Miss Marple noted one final detail, that others had missed. Near the hedge, separating Rawdon land from the lane, the snow showed a faint brushing mark, as if something had been drawn lightly along its surface. The mark was subtle, barely visible, but to Miss Marple's experienced eye it suggested someone had passed this way, carrying something that trailed just enough to kiss the drift, perhaps a length of fabric that needed to be disposed of discreetly. Settling into her cottage with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's revelations with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had observed human nature in all its complexity. People were already making themselves comfortable with a narrative that placed guilt neatly where it was most convenient, but snow told the truth if one asked it the right questions, and clocks too, if one remembered who had set them. The real killer, she suspected, was far more cunning than anyone imagined, and the true motive perhaps even more deeply concealed beneath the seemingly peaceful veneer of village life. The morning after Harold Rawdon's arrest dawned crisp and white over St. Mary Mead, the village settling into an uneasy calm that spoke more of relief than genuine resolution. Miss Marple rose early, her methodical mind already cataloguing the inconsistencies that had troubled her sleep throughout the night. While Inspector Slack's case against Harold appeared compelling on the surface, the accumulation of small details, the peacock-blue thread, the mysteriously pristine coat lining, the 8-minute discrepancy in Sir Henry's timepiece, suggested a more complex truth lurking beneath the convenient narrative. Her first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Trent's encyclopedic knowledge of village comings and goings provided the initial confirmation of Miss Marple's growing suspicions. The postmistress, with the precision that made her invaluable to the community's social fabric, recalled observing Kitty Barnes hurrying past her window at precisely 10:30 the previous evening. "Poor dear looked quite distressed," Mrs. Trent confided, her professional discretion warring with natural curiosity. She was carrying what appeared to be a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper, heading toward the lane that leads to Rawdon Hall. The timing struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. 10:30 would place Kitty near the manor grounds during the crucial window when Lionel met his death. When pressed gently for additional details, Mrs. Trent revealed that Kitty had seemed unusually agitated, repeatedly checking over her shoulder as if concerned about being observed. More intriguingly, when she returned some 40 minutes later, she no longer carried the mysterious parcel, and her earlier distress had been replaced by what Mrs. Trent described as an odd sort of composure, as if she'd resolved some difficult matter. This transformation struck the observant postmistress as sufficiently unusual to warrant specific mention, particularly given Kitty's reputation for emotional transparency. Miss Marple's subsequent examination of the physical evidence at Rawdon Hall proved equally revealing. Mrs. Judd, Sir Henry's unflappable housekeeper, mentioned the side door that provided discreet access to the garden, demonstrating how it required a particular technique to open properly. "Servants know it," she explained matter-of-factly. "Strangers don't." Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the faint impression on the flagstones. Not the heavy boot prints of a man, but the smaller, more refined marks of a woman's footwear. More significantly, caught on the door's iron latch was a tiny wisp of thread, so small as to be nearly invisible. Miss Marple carefully extracted the fragment with her knitting needle, recognizing immediately the distinctive peacock-blue silk that Kitty had used for Lionel's Christmas scarf. The thread's presence on the rarely used door suggested someone had passed this way recently, someone wearing or carrying an item made from that particular silk. Her conversation with Mrs. Judd yielded another crucial detail that others had dismissed as insignificant. The housekeeper mentioned discovering ashes in the study grate that morning, remnants of papers burned during the night. "I noticed a blue tinge like from those cheap Christmas crackers," she observed, with characteristic attention to household details, only we had none in the study. The blue residue, Miss Marple realized, was entirely consistent with the peacock silk dye that Kitty had specifically warned would run when exposed to moisture. A brief encounter with Dr. Gray outside the vicarage provided yet another piece of the developing puzzle. The doctor, carrying his medical bag with its usual professional efficiency, bore a faint but unmistakable smear of peacock-blue along the leather handle stitching. When Miss Marple's observant glance lingered on the mark, Dr. Gray offered a quick explanation about a fountain pen mishap, but his practiced composure carried an undertone of tension that suggested deeper concerns about scrutiny. The revelation that most troubled Miss Marple's sense of justice came during her afternoon visit to Reverend Barnes. The vicar, clearly overwhelmed by his daughter's emotional state, confided his growing concerns about Kitty's behavior since Lionel's death. "She's been asking the most peculiar questions about legal proceedings," he whispered with paternal bewilderment. "Whether statements made under emotional distress carry the same weight as those given calmly. Whether witnesses could be compelled to testify against someone they cared about." These inquiries struck Miss Marple as remarkably sophisticated for someone supposedly consumed by grief, suggesting instead a calculating intelligence working through potential complications. As evening approached and the village settled into its routine of post-crisis normalcy, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the darker aspects of human nature that lurked beneath respectable facades. The physical evidence, the peacock thread, the burned papers, the suspicious timing of movements, painted a picture far more complex than Harold's alleged crime of financial desperation. Someone had orchestrated this tragedy with considerable skill, using Harold's obvious guilt as perfect cover, while systematically destroying evidence and manipulating witness testimony. The grieving fiancée, Miss Marple reflected with growing certainty, had transformed herself into the perfect witness, providing testimony that supported the investigation's preferred narrative while concealing her own intimate involvement in the very crime she had helped solve. The discovery that would ultimately unravel Inspector Slack's carefully constructed case came from an unexpected source, young Timothy Potter, whose extraordinary talent for finding lost objects had made him something of a village legend. 2 days after Harold's arrest, Timothy came scuffing through the thin layer of fresh snow near the hedge bordering the vicarage garden, his keen eyes catching the glint of silver beneath a drift that others had passed without notice. What he unearthed sent ripples of uncertainty through the investigation's tidy conclusions. Lionel's pocket watch, a distinctive family heirloom that Sir Henry had presented to his nephew upon his return from abroad, lay nestled precisely along the path that connected the vicarage to the main road. The timepiece was one that Lionel consulted with almost obsessive frequency, making its absence from his body a detail that Inspector Slack had initially dismissed as a natural consequence of violent struggle. However, the watch's location proved deeply problematic for the official narrative, lying as it did some considerable distance from Rawdon Hall's grounds, far from where Harold supposedly committed his desperate crime. When Reverend Barnes delivered the watch to Inspector Slack, expecting it to provide additional evidence against Harold, the inspector found himself confronting uncomfortable questions about his timeline. The watch had stopped at precisely 10:37, well within the crucial window when Lionel allegedly met his death, but also exactly when Mrs. Trent had observed Kitty Barnes hurrying past the post office with her mysterious brown paper parcel. More troubling still, Miss Marple's sharp eyes detected a faint blue smudge on the silver casing, barely visible, but unmistakably consistent with the peacock silk dye that had been appearing with suspicious frequency throughout the investigation. The implications struck Miss Marple with crystalline clarity as she examined the watch in Sir Henry's study. If Lionel's timepiece had stopped at 10:37 and been found near the vicarage path, it suggested either that Lionel had been alive and moving toward the vicarage well after Harold's alleged attack, or that someone else had possessed the watch and deliberately discarded it there. The blue smudge provided the crucial link, confirming her growing suspicion that the peacock silk scarf, the very one Kitty had knitted with such care, had been in contact with the watch during those critical minutes. Additional disturbing details began emerging from the village's network of observant residents. Mrs. Giles, the vicarage charwoman, mentioned to Mrs. Carter that Kitty had been unusually secretive since the murder, keeping her bedroom door locked and scrubbing her small bedside rug until it was nearly threadbare. "Said she'd spilt tea," Mrs. Giles whispered with the authority of someone who knew the difference between tea stains and other substances. "But it looked more like something blue, like ink." The charwoman's casual observation, when combined with Miss Marple's knowledge of the silk's tendency to bleed when wet, painted a clear picture of frantic evidence destruction. Dr. Gray's missing medical bag provided another piece of the emerging puzzle. The doctor reported its mysterious disappearance from his surgery, only for it to reappear hours later against the churchyard's old stone wall, its contents scattered but nothing of value taken. The bag itself bore fresh scratches along its side, and the faint blue stain that Miss Marple had noted earlier had been vigorously scrubbed, leaving a tellingly lighter patch on the dark leather. While Dr. Gray attributed the incident to vandals, Miss Marple recognized the desperate attempt to remove specific traces that connected the bag to the peacock dye. These seemingly disparate incidents formed an increasingly clear pattern in Miss Marple's methodical mind. The precise timing of the watch, its strategic location, the telltale blue evidence, Kitty's secretive cleaning, the tampering with Dr. Gray's bag, all spoke not of Harold's impulsive financial desperation, but of a carefully orchestrated deception designed to mislead investigators while systematically destroying incriminating evidence. Inspector Slack, though still publicly confident in Harold's guilt, began showing signs of private uncertainty as these new details accumulated. His attempts to integrate the watch's discovery into his existing theory grew increasingly strained, particularly when confronted with the timeline implications. The inspector's earlier certainty gave way to a more cautious approach, though village opinion remained largely convinced that justice had been properly served. Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm as she catalogued each revelation with characteristic patience. The true killer, she now understood with growing certainty, possessed not only remarkable cunning but also intimate knowledge of village routines and relationships. Someone had orchestrated events with theatrical precision, using Harold's obvious vulnerabilities as perfect cover while maintaining an appearance of complete innocence. The grieving fiancé's performance, Miss Marple reflected, had been masterful in its blend of genuine emotion and calculated deception, but like all performances, it contained small imperfections that revealed the artifice beneath. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the psychology required for such elaborate deception. The systematic destruction of evidence, the careful manipulation of witness testimony, the strategic placement of misleading clues, all demonstrated a level of planning that went far beyond crimes of passion or desperation. Someone among them possessed the ruthless intelligence to commit murder and then orchestrate an investigation that would convict an innocent man, all while maintaining the perfect facade of a heartbroken victim seeking justice for her beloved fiancé. Miss Marple's opportunity to test her developing theory arrived the following afternoon when she arranged to visit the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss memorial arrangements for poor Lionel, but actually to engage in the delicate psychological examination that would either confirm or dispel her growing suspicions. Inspector Slack, though still publicly confident in Harold's guilt, had begun showing signs of private uncertainty as the accumulating inconsistencies challenged his carefully constructed case. The vicarage drawing-room provided the perfect setting for Miss Marple's subtle investigation. Kitty Barnes, dressed in appropriate mourning attire, received her visitor with a performance of fragile grief that was almost too perfectly orchestrated. Her red-rimmed eyes and tremulous voice created the expected image of a heartbroken fiancé, but Miss Marple's experienced eye detected something more calculated beneath the veneer of sorrow. "Such a terrible loss, my dear," Miss Marple began gently, settling herself with her knitting bag and extracting a small skein of peacock-blue silk. I brought this to mend a tear in my needlework. The same lovely color as that beautiful scarf you knitted for Lionel." She positioned the silk prominently on the tea table, where the afternoon light made it gleam like a tropical bird among the delicate china cups. Kitty's reaction was immediate and telling, a sharp intake of breath followed by carefully controlled composure. "Yes, it was his favorite shade," she replied, but her voice carried a strained quality that suggested deeper currents beneath her measured words. Miss Marple noted how Kitty's eyes kept returning to the silk with an anxiety that seemed disproportionate to simple grief. "Such distinctive dye," Miss Marple observed conversationally, deliberately adding a drop of hot tea to the silk thread. The Peacock-Blue immediately began to bleed, creating a faint but unmistakable stain on her fingertip. "Dear me, these bizarre silks do run so terribly when wet. I remember warning young ladies about such things. The color can transfer to the most unexpected places." Her seemingly innocent demonstration carried devastating implications for anyone who understood its significance. Kitty's composure visibly cracked as she watched the dye bleeding, her hands trembling as she reached for her teacup. "Yes, I warned Lionel about that," she whispered, then seemed to realize the admission might carry unwanted implications. "About keeping it dry, I mean. Silk is so delicate." Miss Marple's gentle probing revealed increasingly damaging inconsistencies in Kitty's carefully rehearsed narrative. When asked about Lionel's missing pocket watch, Kitty's explanation became oddly detailed for someone supposedly uninformed about the investigation's progress. "Perhaps Harold dropped it while fleeing," she suggested with suspicious promptness. "The path does lead toward the main road, after all." Her quick attempt to incorporate new evidence into the existing theory revealed a mind working desperately to maintain a deceptive framework. The conversation's most telling moment came when Miss Marple casually mentioned the side door at Rawdon Hall that provided discreet garden access. "Mrs. Judd says it requires a particular technique. One must press and lift simultaneously. Only those familiar with the house would know such details." "Oh, yes," Kitty responded automatically. "You must press sideways with your thumb and lift at the same moment, otherwise it sticks terribly." The words escaped before she could prevent them, revealing intimate knowledge that contradicted her claims of unfamiliarity with the servant's entrance. The silence that followed was deafening. Kitty's face went pale as she realized her fatal mistake, while Miss Marple continued her knitting with serene composure. Dr. Gray, who had arrived during the conversation to check on Reverend Barnes, looked sharply at Kitty with professional assessment of her increasingly agitated state. "I suppose," Miss Marple said with gentle persistence, "the police will eventually piece together all these little details. The blue thread caught on the door latch, the dye stains on various items, the precise timing of movements that evening. Such small things individually, but they do form quite a complete picture when assembled properly." Kitty's careful performance finally shattered under the accumulated weight of evidence and psychological pressure. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, her hands clenched into fists, and the desperate vulnerability beneath her grief became unmistakably apparent. The transformation from controlled mourning to barely contained panic was so dramatic that even Reverend Barnes, entering with fresh tea, immediately sensed the charged atmosphere. Miss Marple rose quietly, gathering her knitting materials with the satisfaction of someone whose patient observations had finally yielded the truth. The peacock silk remained on the table like silent testimony to the evening's revelations, its brilliant color now carrying associations far darker than mere decoration. Inspector Slack, summoned by Dr. Gray's urgent message, would find a very different suspect awaiting his questions. One whose carefully constructed alibi had finally collapsed under the gentle but relentless pressure of human psychology and undeniable physical evidence. The real killer had been exposed not through dramatic confrontation, but through the accumulated weight of small inconsistencies and involuntary revelations that betrayed guilt more effectively than any confession. Inspector Slack arrived at the vicarage within the quarter hour, his boots leaving crisp impressions in the fresh snow as he approached the front door with visible reluctance. The drawing room he entered carried an atmosphere of barely contained tension, with Kitty Barnes seated rigidly near the hearth, her carefully maintained facade of grief now showing dangerous cracks. Reverend Barnes hovered nearby with the helpless bewilderment of a man watching his world collapse, while Dr. Gray stood by the mantelpiece, his retrieved medical bag clutched tightly in hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple remained positioned near the window, her knitting needles now still in her lap, the peacock-blue silk thread gleaming accusingly on the tea table between them like a brilliant confession waiting to be read. The inspector's earlier confidence in Harold's guilt had been replaced by the grudging recognition that his carefully constructed case contained too many inconvenient inconsistencies to ignore. "I fear there has been a terrible mistake, Inspector," Miss Marple began with her characteristic gentleness, her voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty. The murder of young Lionel was neither a crime of financial desperation nor the work of professional debt collectors. It was, instead, a carefully orchestrated deception designed to eliminate an inconvenient obstacle, while ensuring that suspicion fell upon the most obvious alternative suspect. She gestured delicately toward the peacock silk, its brilliant color now serving as silent testimony to the evening's revelations. The evidence has been arranged rather artfully, but like a jigsaw puzzle with pieces forced into wrong positions, it creates a picture that appears complete while hiding fundamental flaws beneath its surface. Miss Marple's reconstruction began with the timeline that had seemed so damaging to Harold's case. Sir Henry's mantelpiece clock runs 8 minutes fast, a household device designed to encourage punctuality among the staff. When witnesses testified about Harold's movements, they relied on this clock without considering its discrepancy. Lionel announced his intention to take a walk at 10 o'clock by that timepiece, which was actually 10 minutes to the hour. His own pocket watch, found by young Timothy Potter, stopped at 10:37, the true time of his death, not the earlier moment suggested by the Manor's clocks. The physical evidence told an even more damning story when properly interpreted. Mrs. Trent observed Kitty hurrying past the post office at precisely 10:30, carrying a brown paper parcel. She returned some 40 minutes later without it, her earlier distress replaced by what Mrs. Trent described as an odd sort of composure. This timing places her near Rawdon Hall during the crucial window when Lionel met his death. Miss Marple's gentle fingers traced the silk thread as she continued her methodical dismantling of the false narrative. The scarf that Kitty knitted with such care became both the instrument of murder and the source of her undoing. She had specifically warned about the dye's tendency to run when wet, yet traces of that distinctive peacock-blue appeared everywhere it shouldn't have been, on Lionel's pocket watch, along the inner facing of his discarded coat, even on Dr. Gray's medical bag handle. Dr. Gray shifted uncomfortably as Miss Marple's observant gaze settled on him briefly. The bag was temporarily borrowed to transport evidence that couldn't be safely burned, wasn't it, my dear? The blue stain that appeared on its leather handle was vigorously scrubbed afterward, but peacock silk dye, once transferred, proves remarkably persistent. The careful arrangement of the crime scene revealed the killer's methodical intelligence. Lionel's coat was found several yards from his body, its inner lining remarkably dry despite the continuing snowfall. If it had been removed during a violent struggle, it would have fallen haphazardly, exposing its interior surfaces to the elements. Instead, it was placed deliberately, almost thoughtfully, to suggest robbery or professional violence, while concealing the true nature of the crime. Miss Marple's voice took on a note of gentle sadness as she addressed the psychological manipulation that had nearly succeeded in sending an innocent man to his death. Your performance as the grieving fiancé was masterful, my dear. You provided testimony that supported the investigation's preferred narrative, while appearing to be a heartbroken victim seeking justice. Your tears were genuine, not from grief for Lionel, but from the enormous strain of maintaining such an elaborate deception. The side door at Rawdon Hall provided another crucial piece of evidence. Mrs. Judd mentioned that the servant's entrance requires a particular technique. One must press and lift simultaneously. When I mentioned this detail, you responded automatically with precise instructions about pressing sideways with one's thumb. Only someone intimately familiar with the house would possess such specific knowledge. Kitty's breathing became increasingly labored as Miss Marple's gentle but relentless logic stripped away each layer of her carefully constructed alibi. The evidence that had seemed to exonerate her, her emotional testimony, her apparent cooperation, her visible distress, now revealed itself as an elaborate performance designed to deflect suspicion while actively directing it toward Harold's obvious vulnerabilities. The confrontation in the garden that evening began as a romantic meeting. Miss Marple continued with inexorable precision. Lionel was walking toward the vicarage, not away from it as evidenced by his watch being found on that path. He was coming to you, Kitty, perhaps to discuss his plans for the future. Plans that didn't include the marriage you had expected. The motive, when finally revealed, proved both simpler and more devastating than the financial desperation that had seemed so compelling in Harold's case. Young men who live as Lionel did often make promises they cannot keep, particularly when debts and family obligations create pressures they feel unable to manage. He was planning to break your engagement, wasn't he? Perhaps he had even found someone else, someone whose circumstances better suited his needs. Kitty's carefully maintained composure finally cracked under the accumulated weight of evidence and psychological pressure. Her hands rose to cover her face as great, shuddering sobs began to shake her slight frame. "He was going to leave me," she gasped, her voice raw with a mixture of grief and fury that had been building for weeks. After all his promises, all his declarations of love, he was planning to disappear to London, leaving me with nothing but shame and broken promises. The words poured forth in a torrent of betrayed rage and desperate justification. I met him by the oak tree. I begged him to reconsider, to remember what we had meant to each other. But he just laughed at me, said I was being foolish, that I didn't understand the realities of his situation. The scarf I had knitted with such care, the Christmas gift I had made with my own hands. He was wearing it mockingly, as if it was some joke between us. Her voice dropped to barely audible levels as she described the fatal moment. I grabbed the ends of the scarf, just to make him listen, to force him to take me seriously. But he kept laughing, kept saying cruel things about my expectations and my naivety. The silk was so smooth, so easy to pull tight, and suddenly he wasn't laughing anymore. The methodical disposal of evidence revealed a calculating intelligence working beneath her emotional breakdown. I knew Harold would be suspected. His debts, his obvious resentment of Lionel, his nervous behavior that evening. I arranged the scene to support that theory, removed the scarf and Lionel's watch, even took his coat off to suggest robbery. The scarf I burned in the study grate, but the dye had already transferred to everything it touched. Inspector Slack, his professional humility replacing his earlier certainty, began the formal procedures that would see Harold released and Kitty charged with Lionel's murder. The case that had seemed so straightforward revealed itself as a masterpiece of deception, one that had nearly succeeded in its ultimate goal of perfect concealment through misdirection and psychological manipulation. As the formalities concluded and Kitty was led away, Miss Marple gathered her knitting materials with quiet satisfaction. The peacock silk she wound carefully away, its brilliant color now forever associated with the darker aspects of human nature that could lurk beneath the most respectable facades. In her long experience with village life, she had observed that the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood human psychology well enough to manipulate it, using society's expectations and prejudices as weapons in their own defense. The snow continued falling outside, honest and indiscriminate, gradually covering the evidence of tragedy beneath its pristine blanket. Harold Rawdon would return home to rebuild his reputation. Sir Henry would mourn his nephew while grappling with the knowledge of how thoroughly he had been deceived, and the village would eventually settle back into its familiar rhythms. But the memory of how close they had come to a terrible injustice would linger, a reminder that human nature, in all its complexity, remained the most challenging puzzle of all. Miss Marple walked home through the gently falling snow, reflecting on the curious ways people revealed their true character under pressure. The grieving fiancée had transformed herself into the perfect witness, providing testimony that supported the investigation's preferred narrative, while concealing her own intimate involvement in the very crime she had helped solve. It was, she thought with characteristic understatement, a most instructive evening in the study of human behavior, though she rather hoped St. Mary Mead would return to its usual peaceful concerns for the remainder of the Christmas season. The raw shock of Kitty Barnes's confession reverberated through the vicarage drawing room like a physical blow, leaving Inspector Slack to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that his carefully constructed case had been built upon deliberate deception rather than genuine evidence. The methodical policeman, his professional pride somewhat bruised but his integrity intact, immediately set in motion the procedures that would see Harold Rawdon released and the true killer brought to justice. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was palpable. Where moments before there had been the comfortable certainty of solved crime, now there lingered the unsettling recognition of how thoroughly they had all been manipulated by someone they had trusted implicitly. Harold Rawdon returned from his brief imprisonment, a fundamentally changed man, the experience having stripped away his earlier nervous pretensions and left behind someone who understood precisely how fragile the line between respectability and ruin could be. When he called upon Miss Marple the following afternoon, carrying an awkward bouquet of winter roses, his gratitude was both profound and humbling. "I owe you my life, Miss Marple," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of its former defensive bluster. The inspector was quite convinced of my guilt, and I must admit the evidence seemed overwhelming even to me. The ordeal had taught him valuable lessons about both human nature and his own character, lessons he seemed determined to apply in rebuilding his reputation through actions rather than words. Sir Henry's response to the revelation carried the weight of personal betrayal alongside his grief for his nephew. The elderly diplomat, accustomed to reading character and motivation in international negotiations, found himself profoundly shaken by how thoroughly he had been deceived by someone he had welcomed into his home with genuine affection. "She sat in my drawing room," he confided to Miss Marple during her condolence visit, accepting sympathy for her loss, while knowing she had caused it herself. The calculation required for such deception suggests a mind far more dangerous than any of us imagined. Yet even in his disillusionment, Sir Henry's fundamental decency asserted itself. He quietly arranged for a weekly basket to be delivered to needy families in the village, with no name attached, as if private charity might somehow balance the scales of justice. Dr. Gray's involvement in the case, however unwitting, had left him examining his own professional judgment with uncomfortable scrutiny. The medical bag that had been temporarily appropriated for evidence disposal, the blue stain he had failed to recognize as significant, his ready acceptance of Kitty's emotional distress as genuine grief, all served as reminders that even trained observers could be manipulated by someone who understood the psychology of deception. "I pride myself on reading people accurately," he admitted to Miss Marple with characteristic honesty. But she played her role so convincingly that I never questioned whether her tears were for Lionel's death or her own desperate situation. Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the next morning, brisk and embarrassed, carrying a paper-wrapped parcel that proved to contain an excellent Dundee cake, the official gratitude of a man who preferred actions to lengthy apologies. He admitted that the manor's fast clock had misled him, that neat motives could be dangerous because they relieve the mind of necessary work. "I'll be checking every household timepiece from now on," he promised with gruff sincerity, "and if you wouldn't mind telling me sooner next time." Miss Marple smiled and replied that next times were to be discouraged, but if they insisted on occurring, she would do what she could. The broader community struggled to reconcile the sweet, devoted vicar's daughter they thought they knew with the calculating killer Miss Marple had exposed. Mrs. Carter, who had been so vociferous in her theories about dangerous London creditors, now found herself reluctantly impressed by the deceptive sophistication of someone she had always considered merely ordinary. "One never knows what people are truly capable of," she confided to anyone who would listen, her usual authority somewhat diminished by the recognition that her judgment had been so thoroughly challenged. Reverend Barnes, caught between his role as spiritual guide and his anguish as a father, sought Miss Marple's counsel about continuing his ministry in the face of such personal tragedy. "I keep wondering if there were signs I missed," he confessed with paternal torment. "Moments when her true nature revealed itself, but I was too blind with love to recognize them." Miss Marple's gentle wisdom reminded him that people required not perfection, but steadfast service, and that a congregation could forgive a flawed sermon more readily than it could forgive abandonment. As the immediate shock subsided and the village began its slow process of adjustment, Miss Marple reflected on the psychological sophistication that had made Kitty's deception so nearly successful. The systematic destruction of evidence, the careful manipulation of witness testimony, the strategic placement of misleading clues, all demonstrated a level of planning that went far beyond crimes of passion or desperation. Evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs, she observed to those who sought to understand how they had been so thoroughly fooled. It often wears the mask of virtue, speaks the language of righteousness, and presents itself as the victim rather than the perpetrator. The physical evidence that had seemed so damning against Harold now told its true story with crystalline clarity. The peacock silk thread caught on the servant's door, the dye stains on various items, the precise timing discrepancies created by the manor's fast clock. Each detail confirmed the methodical intelligence behind what had initially appeared to be a crime of passion. Inspector Slack's reconstruction revealed how Kitty had used her intimate knowledge of both Lionel's habits and the household routines to create the perfect frame for Harold's guilt, while systematically destroying evidence of her own involvement. The Christmas season, which had begun with such tragedy, concluded with a deeper understanding of how appearances could deceive and how the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood human psychology well enough to manipulate it for their own purposes. The village gradually returned to its familiar rhythms, though with a more cautious awareness of the complexities that could lurk beneath even the most respectable facades. Young Timothy Potter received half a crown from Sir Henry for his sharp eyes in finding the crucial pocket watch, along with the solemn instruction never to ignore what glints beneath snow. The boy, who fully intended never to ignore anything that glinted anywhere, became something of a local hero, his discovery having provided the key evidence that ultimately unraveled Kitty's elaborate deception. As the snow continued to melt and spring approached St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple settled into her cottage with her knitting. The peacock silk, what remained of it, wound carefully around a card and tucked among her patterns as a reminder that dyes run, and so do stories. The familiar click of her needles resumed its comforting rhythm as she reflected on the curious ways truth eventually surfaced, despite the most elaborate attempts at concealment. Human nature, she mused, was indeed like a village in snow. All irregularities looked smooth at first glance, but beneath the soft surface the familiar patterns remained, waiting for a careful observer to recognize them. People did as they had always done. They loved, they deceived, they hoped to be better, and sometimes they genuinely were. The peacock silk had told its story in the end, brilliant and beautiful, and ultimately betraying the darkness it had been used to conceal, proving once again that in matters of human behavior, the smallest details often revealed the largest truths. Outside her window, the church clock struck the hour with its usual obstinate dignity, keeping its own reliable time while the world around it slowly healed from winter's harsh lessons. St. Mary Mead, having learned another of its quiet but profound lessons about the complexity of human nature, settled back into the comforting rhythm of ordinary life, where the greatest mysteries were usually no more dramatic than who had been borrowing books from the lending library without properly signing them out. The raw confession that had shattered the vicarage drawing-room's genteel atmosphere left its occupants to grapple with the uncomfortable recognition of how thoroughly they had been deceived. Inspector Slack, his professional humility replacing earlier certainty, began the delicate process of unwinding a case built upon deliberate misdirection. The transformation was profound. Where moments before there had been comfortable certainty about Harold's guilt, now lingered the unsettling awareness that truth often wore masks more sophisticated than any of them had imagined. Harold Rawdon returned from his brief imprisonment fundamentally changed, the experience having stripped away his nervous pretensions and revealed a core of unexpected dignity. When he visited Miss Marple the following week, carrying winter roses from his garden, his gratitude carried the weight of someone who understood precisely how fragile the line between respectability and ruin could be. Sir Henry's response proved equally transformative. The elderly diplomat, shaken by how completely he had misjudged character despite decades of international experience, quietly offered Harold a position managing the estate's legal affairs. It was practical mercy, wrapped in mutual understanding, both men recognizing that waste, whether financial or moral, served no useful purpose. Inspector Slack made several visits to Miss Marple throughout the spring, ostensibly discussing minor village matters, but actually absorbing her insights about human psychology. The experience of nearly convicting an innocent man had profoundly affected his investigative approach, making him more cautious about accepting convenient explanations and more attentive to the psychological motivations that drove desperate acts. "I'll be checking every household timepiece from now on," he promised with gruff sincerity, understanding how Sir Henry's fast clock had nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. The broader community struggled to reconcile their memories of sweet, devoted Kitty Barnes with the calculating killer Miss Marple had exposed. Mrs. Carter, whose theories about dangerous London creditors had seemed so authoritative, now found herself reluctantly impressed by the deceptive sophistication of someone she had always considered merely ordinary. "One never knows what people are truly capable of," she confided with characteristic authority, though her usual certainty had been somewhat tempered by recognition that her judgment had been so thoroughly challenged. Reverend Barnes bore his burden with Christian fortitude, though the light in his eyes had dimmed irrevocably. He continued his duties, his sermons now carrying deeper understanding of human frailty, while the congregation rallied around him with support that spoke well of their collective character. Miss Marple's gentle counsel reminded him that people required not perfection, but steadfast service, and that routine was indeed a rope across thin ice during times of crisis. Dr. Gray's practice continued with its usual efficiency, though he confessed to paying closer attention to his patients' emotional states, recognizing how easily genuine distress could mask more dangerous psychological conditions. The blue stain on his medical bag had been completely removed, but the memory of how it appeared served as a permanent reminder that even trained observers could be manipulated by those who understood the psychology of deception. As spring arrived early that year, melting the snow that had concealed so many secrets, Miss Marple reflected on the case's deeper implications during her evening walks through the churchyard. The peacock silk, with its brilliant beauty and tendency to bleed when wet, had become in her mind a perfect metaphor for how appearances could deceive, and how the most attractive surfaces often concealed dangerous truths. Human nature, she mused, was indeed like a village in snow. All irregularities looked smooth at first glance, but beneath the soft surface the familiar patterns remained, waiting for careful observers to recognize them. The village had learned valuable lessons about the complexity of human motivation and the dangers of accepting surface appearances without deeper investigation. Evil rarely announced itself with obvious signs, Miss Marple reflected, but more often wore virtue's mask, spoke righteousness's language, and presented itself as victim rather than perpetrator. Yet they had also discovered that careful observation, patient investigation, and courage to question comfortable assumptions could ultimately expose even the most sophisticated deceptions. Settling into her cottage as summer approached, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the steady click of needles providing comforting counterpoint to her reflections. The peacock silk had long since been used in various small projects, but its memory remained as reminder that the most beautiful things sometimes concealed the darkest purposes. Outside her window, the church clock struck the hour with its usual reliable dignity, and Miss Marple smiled, content that St. Mary Mead had weathered another storm and emerged with deeper understanding of both darkness and light residing in the human heart. The greatest mysteries, she knew, invariably revealed the most about the endlessly fascinating complexity of human nature.